Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Sunday evening, for taking time out of your precious Sunday to talk about Twitter and groomers. I'm here with James, Lindsay, of course. James, thank you so much for making the time tonight. I really appreciate it. I know you're busy and about to take off for some travel, so thank you.
Yeah, I got a busy week ahead of me, so I'm glad we could get it in tonight. Should be fun.
Yeah, I'm super glad that we could fit it in. Okay, let's start with the big news, which is that you were perma-banned from Twitter. What happened there?
Well, there are trans activists, and then there are trans activists. I've been poking the bear with not just trans activists, but in general around this so-called thing that people are giving like 11 million names: gender ideology, queer theory, whatever it happens to be, and the sexualization of children through introduction of kind of destabilizing the categories of sex, gender, and sexuality through queer theory, which emerged in the 80s and has gotten properly crazy since. And so because it's kind of a cult grooming thing, I've been calling them groomers since last fall. Twitter personalities erupted in anger a few times between October, when I started doing it, and the present. They had a huge blow up about it in October, November, another one in March. They seemed pretty powerless to do anything about me saying "okay, groomer" in a very dismissive way, echoing, of course, "okay, boomer" from previous election, I guess, mockery or whatever. And so finally, they changed the rules on Twitter, unbeknownst to anybody, because as if anybody pays attention to that, and changed the rule in February. I hear that groomer became, when directed at somebody who is LGBTQ plus whatever, a term of hate speech. It is a slur against them, which of course is not so good for most gays and lesbians who aren't into the grooming of children and are now, it's being reified as one, if somebody was a Marxist might say, it's being reified that groomer means them, even though it doesn't. But this means that these activists can continue to, silence people who are pointing out that the introduction of sexual ideology with children is not appropriate. So they start calling them groomer. They finally got me banned for 12 hours for calling them groomer a couple of weeks ago. There's a Media Matters kind of hit piece or whatever that came out about it.
That's all they do, I think. Right?
It is. It's like there's 4 or 5 people at a handful of like hard left organizations that have shadowy funding that kind of run the board of social media. It comes down to something like this. So they did a hit piece on me and Libs of TikTok and another account called Gays Against Groomers, which really messes up their whole program. That's run by a lesbian woman named Jamie, who's wonderful. And so I got kicked out for 12 hours for saying "okay, groomer" to one of these trans people. In that case, that works at Media Matters, and there are a number of other people. There's this one character whose handle is something along the lines of "s queer" with some underscores or something.
I looked him
What
up.
is it? Alejandra Carabello or some Ballo or some, I don't know, some Harvard, some kind of Harvard something or another.
Instructor, not professor. He pointed out
of
on
course,
his own
it's probably
Twitter
an
feed.
adjunct for $2,000 a semester that's getting absolutely exploited.
Probably
sucks for your life. But anyways, I did the "okay, groomer" to this trans person, Ari Drennan from Media Matters, and that got me booted 12 hours. I get back on, and then about 5 days later, I got booted again for another "okay, groomer." I was like, oh, I see what's happening. They're going after they've reported all the old "okay, groomer" tweets. There are 1,000 of them. Better go delete the ones where I call somebody a groomer proactively. So I spent an evening doing that in a hotel room in DC. I'd just arrived for an event, and I spent the whole night, like, instead of going and meeting with people, deleting tweets. And so then it came to my mind that it would be clever to use a different phrase to beat them at their word game. So I started calling them child sexualization specialists. And that pissed them off. And apparently child sexualization specialist is, in Twitter's eyes, worthy of a permanent ban. So the actual tweet argument, I'd come up with this idea. So I went to Caraballo's page to see if there's anything that I could attach it to see what would happen. and it's good to poke the bear. And Caraballo's page there had something saying Alex Jones's attorneys are curing us all of imposter syndrome. So I was like distracted by this and said, well, now do Kamala Harris. And the reply was, your misogynoir is showing.
Oh, okay.
And I said, oh, okay, child sexualization specialist. And here we are. Lifetime ban from Twitter for that. Which to me is like admitting guilt, but okay.
I didn't know. I knew that Reddit had banned groomer, which is weird. I didn't realize that Twitter had also actually made that an official rule. So it's specifically that you can't call anybody who identifies as anything under the LGBTQ, et cetera, umbrella as groomer. That constitutes what, hate speech?
Yeah. Right. So far as I understand, because there are a lot of reports that didn't go anywhere, and they frustratedly posted them, what Twitter emailed to, because they want to leverage against Twitter and say, look how evil Twitter is. They said this. And the reply Twitter had been giving them is context matters, which is why it must be only when you're calling us, which is why I think Hillary Clinton just said that somebody's grooming somebody. And so it's context matters. In other words, we get to determine when it's inappropriate, when it's not. But it's hate speech if it's against an LGBTQ, whatever extra letters we have to go with, all the way to the end of BS to get to it. But it's hate speech now to apply that to a member of a protected class who may or may not actually be engaging in the practice of grooming.
I mean, how ridiculous. Because first of all, what if this person actually is a groomer? Then I suppose it's still banned for you to say so if they choose to identify as transgender or whatever, which seems to be like a handy loophole, right?
Handy.
But what is it like? What do you mean when you say groomer? Like when you're
I actually don't mean what they're accusing me of. Because they're like, are you saying that? And I got asked this by journalists. I got asked this. I've had to go on TV and I get asked about this. Are you saying that this person's a pedophile? No, I'm not. I am talking about cult grooming, which we now have to pretend doesn't exist, because groomer has a sexual context that's the dominant context. And so the subordinate context is not to be able to be recognized. And I was actually accusing people of using the excuse of education to bring children into the ideas of queer theory, which is queer Marxism. So it's like it's cult grooming into a particular view of the world and the body and what is possible and impossible and what your feelings dictate about your body and so on. So, like, for example, specifically that if you feel like maybe you aren't the sex that you are, then that could be changed, which of course I think we share having been in trouble for recognizing that isn't something that's real. So anyway, I mean the cult grooming, and I've been very specific about it again and again and again. In fact, early on, as I deleted all those tweets, I cracked up. I mean, crying, laughing in the hotel room because I called Big Bird a groomer at one point. Like, Big Bird has an official account, and groomer to Big Bird. But what Big Bird was doing was talking about the vaccine. He wasn't talking about any of the sexuality stuff, but I was like, well, you're grooming kids into thinking this is how you. So it's very obvious that I wasn't talking about anything about pedophiles, except maybe in cases where, there are reasons to believe that that's what was going on. I think I commented on some stories where it actually was, people who got busted for that with, evidence or whatever. But predominantly I'm talking about the cult grooming into queer ideology or queer theory. And that, I don't know. I mean, we should talk about Paulo Freire and what he's done to education and the concept of generative themes and the way that you repurpose education to be a consciousness raising process instead of an education process, which I see as a grooming process to get people to see the world in a particular way, as opposed to, say, learning math. But that's what, say, Drag Queen Story Hour is about. They wrote an academic paper about it saying that that's what it's about, just to introduce the idea of living queerly to children. Using the drag queen as a generative object. In other words, something you bring in front of the children that then leads them to ask the question, that then leads you to have the discussion, why are sometimes men dressed like women? And now you're having this weird gender bender conversation with second graders. And I say, okay, grooming, and that's apparently not okay.
Yeah. And I mean, you're right. Like, it's become super normalized for the classroom to be a political space, and very few people seem to be questioning the normalization of teachers teaching either politics, like their own personal politics, to the kids in their classroom, or, ideologies. I mean, one and the same in many ways, right? In this case, what we're talking about is we're talking about teachers either talking to kids about like their personal sex or dating lives, which is really inappropriate and strange, but apparently okay if you're queer. And then, of course, teaching kids these ideas that like it's normal for, maybe you're a girl and you like boy things, that must mean you're an actual boy. And some people don't have gender, and some people are non-binary, and some people might switch back and forth. And you might need to call this little boy she from now on.
Yeah, or that they can change it at 12 o'clock on Tuesdays or whatever. Like, I've actually knew somebody where that was the request. It was like on Tuesdays and Thursdays at noon, they changed. And there was a professor friend of mine was asked to accommodate this, and he said, no, I won't. And the person flipped out, but nothing happened, because his defense was, I've got way too much to pay attention to. I'm going to call you by one pronoun and one pronoun only. You, second person, point you. That's who talks. And it's like, I'm just not doing this. And so he didn't get in trouble for it, but that was a request. So yeah, this is not a well, it's better to say that this is a very peculiar, not in the sense of strange, but also yes, but very in a very specific and narrow is the technical definition of peculiar view of the world and human bodies and sex and gender and all of these topics. And so to be able to be political about this, and of course not about anything else, is something very strange. Of course, we know the trick, right? Teaching is a political act, meaning it's intrinsically political. You have to transmit politics. Therefore, some politics are liberatory and good, and all other politics are status quo and bad. And so they get to create a double standard for their politics while excluding everybody else's. This is the trick by which nobody's decided that this should be questioned at all, because all I have to say is, well, if you say we can't do that, that's political too.
And it's so self-important. I mean, I
Oh my
find these
gosh.
teachers so narcissistic to think that they should be
Right?
imposing their supposed political wisdom on these kids, as though they are they know right from wrong. They are the
Yeah.
ones who know right from wrong. And probably these kids have like ignorant parents. God forbid they're Republicans, or Christian. And so it's their job to impose their so-called progressive politics onto these kids, right?
Yeah, I say all the time now, it's like nobody's child is your narcissistic supply or some teacher's narcissistic supply. It's like, I get it. You have whatever reason that this is like your thing and you need this to feel whole, that people are going to talk about your sex life all the time, including apparently children, because you have this desperate need to be affirmed. But nobody else's children, actually not even your own children, are there to affirm you. This is a well-known pathway, in fact, to inducing borderline personality disorder, is that a narcissistic parent uses the child as a narcissistic supply and therefore as a foil for affirmation. And this actually breaks the child's psyche. It is completely inappropriate that teachers would be doing this. This is the kind of thing that up until 5 years ago would have been grounds for dismissal of a teacher, because it's an abuse of that position. But now, of course, that's impossible to do. And we're miles deep into this revolution or whatever we're in, where apparently everything that made sense 5 years ago is, in fact, not just not okay, it is horrifically evil and conservative, and probably Trump, MAGA, American flag waving, eagles flying from the sky, like every bad thing you can possibly imagine, and like Hitler at the same time, because it was normal in 2015.
Yeah. I mean, why is it that these people, for example, this Alejandra person bragged about having gotten you banned from Twitter. He obviously, like, he showed the screenshots of him like reporting your tweet over and over and over again, and was like, let James know I did it. But like, these people are allowed to go around calling people all sorts of names, like libelous names, like names that should be
Misogynoir?
very misogynoir. Like,
Which
I
I
don't
said was a
know.
made up word, by the way, into
Yeah, I
which
was
they
just gonna say, what
replied.
does that
They
mean?
said every word is made up. And I'm like, how postmodern can you get?
Touche.
Yeah, I looked it up though. I didn't have to look it up. They posted a screenshot of the Wikipedia entry. So I'm moved, obviously. I'm like, oh shit, a Wikipedia entry. Game over for me. It
Yeah.
was coined in 2010. This is a made up activist word that was invented 12 years ago. It's
And what does
fake.
it mean,
It
supposedly,
means
according to
the same as
Wikipedia?
misogyny, but against women of color, and specifically, especially black women. See,
Oh, okay.
it's French for black, noir. Ah. And so misogyn, oh, it's a portmanteau. Ooh, fancy language games. And but yeah, they can accuse me of having a bigotry against black women and a bigotry against lesbians and gays and bisexuals and trans. And I'm probably actually legit against the Q, because the Q, if you read their books, Saint Foucault, for example, by David Halperin from 1995, is intrinsically a political orientation. They say it's intrinsically. There's not a queer person in the sense of their identity. A queer person is a political identity. They say so. So, I mean, I'm against that political identity. So I guess I am biased against the Q, but certainly not the L, G, and B, not at all. And the T is a case by case kind of thing. So a priori, I'm not. And so the Q is a political orientation. So I think like I have every right to be against a political orientation. But this all to be said that they can accuse me of these bigotries, and that this mass reporting game that Alejandro or whatever, Alejandrex is playing. This mass reporting game is actually against Twitter's terms of service. As a matter of fact, I've had a handful of attorneys inform me that it's tortious interference. So it's not just against Twitter's TOS. It's against Twitter's TOS because it's actually legally actionable under tort law that they can't do that.
Why? Like, does it constitute harassment or something?
It is a harassment. That's probably Twitter's. And then tortious interference is that Twitter has a contract with each of its users implicitly through the user agreement. And so any third party that comes in and manipulates the terms of that contract, and then Twitter takes action about it, either side of the contract takes action as a result of it, is that third party interfered in the contract between Twitter and whatever party. And so it's actually legally actionable that you can't do that, and it's against their terms of service. But of course, why is it like this? That was the question, right? Well, Project Veritas talked to some of their people on camera, and what did they say? Commie as fuck. That's what it's like in Twitter. That's why. Everything that's happening right now has an explanation. It's a C word. It's not the one that you're not allowed to say. It's communism. Reinvented to be applied through identity politics to create, as you said, very convenient loopholes for certain types of activists who, in a sense, become invincible. Which is what you need if you're going to have this kind of revolution. You couldn't possibly have a free dialogue space or a level playing field, because you can't implement something from a minority of an extreme minority that's extremely unpopular and extremely dangerous without a very biased playing field. And so that's what's actually behind this. I don't call it queer theory, as a matter of fact. I call it queer Marxism.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? Like, how does this constitute? I mean, would you call it like a modern form of Marxism, or
postmodern form, actually? But yeah,
okay. Or communism?
Yeah, well, it's more technically than communism. It's neo-communism because it's based off of neo-Marxist theory instead of Marxist theory. But these are these kinds of like word games that like just lose people, and it's not really necessary to get into it. But why would I say that queer theory is a form of Marxism is because there's this, what is Marxism at its heart? It's got a couple of pieces. It has a theory of how the world is organized, and has a theory of what a man or a person, humankind, is within the world. So it's, in that sense, a philosophy. You could call it a religion or a theology if you wanted. But what the description of the world is that there are certain people in power. They get to designate the terms of society. So they create forms of property that they give themselves access to and exclude other people from in order to maintain their power. Bourgeois people give themselves access to private property while excluding, say, the serfs or whatever from the private property. And so that's the economic theory of it. But you have a special form of property that privileged people have access to by definition. That's what makes them privileged. And they rig the system so that they keep that property and exclude other people from it. And this is something you can awaken to as the nature of how society works. So what is a person? A person is somebody who can be awakened to this fact and be transformative by changing it into what it should have been, which is without that particular power dynamic that structures society. And in fact, you can take it to its logical conclusion, as Marx said, that it's not enough to be against private property. He calls that crude communism. You have to transcend. And in fact, communism needs to be the positive transcendence. This is what he actually wrote: the positive transcendence of private property and thus human self-estrangement, which is a very kind of religious concept, that you're going to overcome self-estrangement at this level of the species. That's sort of like a deliver us to the kingdom of God sort of thing. But so that property can be real, like material property, private property. And Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, which, by the way, when you bring this up, communists will actually tell you it's not in there. It's in there a bunch of times, but it's very explicit in the second chapter. Marx says that communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is the abolition of private property, which turns out not to be a sentence, but that's okay. It's something. It's a clause, but that's what it is: abolish private property. Okay, so if you transmute, if you get a little flexible, a little squishy with what property means, and you say, well, property is socially constructed under Marxism anyway, right? It's a legal fiction. So you don't really own things. We have an agreement that, your can, my coffee cup over here, that you can't take it from me, or that this land that I sit on, that you can't come squat on it and now it's your land. We have a legal fiction that protects that. That's their view of it. It's fake. And so we're going to abolish this fiction and liberate man from being able to hoard things from one another. Okay, well, what if you go to cultural property or social property and you say, for example, that being able to consider yourself normal, the normal people, the people who said, well, I'm normal, and so everybody like me is normal, so we're the normal people, and then outside of that realm, there are people who are not normal or abnormal, and we'll call them queer. And those people will be excluded from all the benefits of being considered normal in society. You've created the same exact thing with a kind of conceptual form of property that is being designated as normalcy or normative, as it were. And then when you look through the queer theory literature, you see, well, David Halperin says that queer is by definition oppositional to whatever falls into that category. So you already see the Marxist antagonistic approach, stratification with antagonism across the line. So that's there. But if you read back even to Gail Rubin in like the 80s, like Thinking Sex 84, she's saying, what's the essential point she's making? Well, people who are deemed perverts are excluded from, being able to be themselves in society. You can't wear your kink leathers to the office. She complains about this in the paper. So they're excluded. So what you now have is literally a Marxist theory of what it means to be normal in society, which is a particular way of viewing the concept of normalcy and abnormality, or falling within the range of being socially and professionally acceptable or not. But that's a very particular perspective on that issue that in fact is being dragged into a Marxist style analysis, where the form of property is this kind of abstract cultural property or social property, instead of being, I would say concrete physical property, but it's not concrete physical property. The only thing that makes my physical property mine is that we have legal fictions that say that I can like punch you if you try to take it from me. In my state, in Tennessee, I don't know. I was told a long time ago that I can't shoot you if you threaten me, but if you try to steal anything from me, I can shoot you dead.
Right.
So yeah, you're allowed to protect your private property with rather extreme force, but that's because of those laws. Same thing, this is just a form of social property instead. And that's in parallel, by the way. The bridge here that I haven't mentioned is the critical race theory concept of whiteness as property, which I'm now analogizing from. Cheryl Harris in 1993 writes Whiteness as Property. That's a paper, long Harvard Law Review or Columbia Law Review, one or the other paper, and very long. And she outlines that whiteness is a form of cultural property. It works just like private property. And she says the point is that it's a bourgeois form of property that white people assign to themselves through the creation of race. And therefore, the analysis in critical race theory is, my previous book was titled Race Marxism, largely for this reason. It is a Marxist theory of the form of cultural property called whiteness. Normalcy is the thing for queer theory, being considered normal instead of a freak, a pervert, a weirdo, a deviant, a degenerate, or a queer, as they reclaim the term as a site of oppositional power.
It's funny because what they really are doing, and it's like, and it's interesting because Gail Rubin essentially admitted to this. Like, she complains about people with perversions being excluded from society, and what they've done is they've fully normalized perversions. Like, we've normalized autogynephilia in public, and not just normalized, but we're forced to accept it, pretend it's normal, look at it, pretend that men who have these fetishes for wearing women's clothing are actual women. And then you look at like the pride parades where like furries and these like puppy play, like dudes in leather, obviously tons of BDSM stuff. Is this isn't about celebrating love is love. This is about celebrating sexual fetishes. And kids are supposed to be able to participate in these kinds of events. And then now we have Drag Queen Story Hour, which I don't necessarily think that all drag queens have some kind of fetish, but I think that arguably, and I mean, you can talk about this more. I think that you've spent a lot of time talking about this issue more than I have. Arguably, it is a sexualized performance that is being brought to and normalized for kids, and people deny that, and of course accuse anybody who's questioning or critical of these story hours of being anti-LGBTQ, i.e. homophobic, i.e. bad.
Yeah, and they're lying. And the reason that they're doing what you said, which is that they are creating this kind of celebratory, but then the exclusion of that which had previously been considered normal, is because all of Marxist theory is an inversion of the thing that it says that it is. It's literally, Marx didn't want to create a communist. Well, maybe he envisioned, hoped for a communist utopia, but the socialist stage in between was that his people got to control all the resources of society and be the new aristocrats. And eventually it was supposed to work out. So in the meantime, the way that if queer theory is actually a form of Marxism on social property, the way that it would work is they get to be the arbiters of what's acceptable and not. The people who previously are going to be completely excluded from this. They're going to call this equity. And then sooner or later it might work out. But yes, the thing about drag queens, the challenge is actually, and this is a thing that's happening in several states, is lawmakers are now looking at how do you prevent these sexualized performances in front of children, whether it's in schools, whether it's in libraries, whether it's in bars that parents are bringing their kids to. My town just had one in the park last weekend, and the people here are not happy. But the question is, how do you do it? And how do you define a drag queen? How do you define sexual? How do you define obscenity or indecency? And those are these things that people are kind of a nebulous view of, that they've made it almost impossible to nail down, because the definitions in law used to be what any reasonable person would agree upon. And now everything's become so hyper partisan and so polarized and also so postmodern. There is no such thing as a reasonable person anymore. Luckily, the drag queens, turns out a lot of these people just like, they can't help themselves. It's like they're all bragging about how clever they think they are. And so, like, for example, they advertise Drag Queen Story Hour as being family friendly. I'll just read to you from a paragraph, or not even a whole paragraph, half of a paragraph from the conclusion of this paper called Drag Pedagogy, that was written by a drag queen by the stage name Little Miss Hot Mess, which is what they were allowed to publish the article as Little Miss Hot Mess, in Curriculum Inquiry, which, by the way, is a major curriculum journal. But they said, I want to see where do I want to start. That says that it may be that Drag Queen Story Hour is, quote, family friendly in the sense that it is accessible and inviting to families with children, but it is less a sanitizing force than it is a preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. Here, Drag Queen Story Hour is, quote, family friendly in the sense of, quote, family as an old school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. So it's like they're telling you that what they're doing is a lie. And that they actually, somewhere in this paper, I don't have like every little piece of it, I just kind of searched it real quick on my laptop here. They actually say that, making this about LGBT empathy and inclusion is a marketing strategy, so it will be included, but the real point is to induce children to see a different way of life and to help lead them to, in italics, live queerly, which is the G word you're not allowed to use. It's like I'm screaming the G word in my head. It's like, what do you call trying to introduce children to a different way of thinking and being so that they might live, say, in a way that's consistent with that ideology, other than the G word that you're not allowed to say anymore. And when it's about topics of sex, gender, and sexuality, where you are normalizing the ideas, for example, of let's talk about sexual topics between adults and children. How about you don't tell your parents? They might think it's weird, which are things that they're doing. They're trying to pass laws and some shit.
Come stay at my house, I'll help you. Like, I've seen trans activists post on Twitter, like, any, so-called trans kids, there's no such thing as a trans kid, but let's just use their words. Like, any trans kids who are in a state that are trying to, like, ban gender affirming care, or whatever they want to call giving kids puberty blockers and surgeries and whatnot. You can come stay with me, like, in my state, like, I'll help you out. Like,
well, that's the thing California is doing. That Scott Wiener, or whatever, how somebody told me it's not pronounced Wiener, but it's spelled Wiener. Scott Wiener, and I don't know how it's actually pronounced, but Scott Wiener is state senator in California from, of course, San Francisco, author of many dubious bills. But they've got now, I think it's now passed the assembly, but I don't know that it's been signed into law yet, but they've got something on the docket there, or already passed. I don't know. See, you get kicked out of Twitter and suddenly you're like disconnected from, what was happening minute by minute in the world until you're not on there. And now you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Tell me about it. I'm always like, wait, what happened? Like,
yeah,
I knew that you got banned from Twitter because I think Bridget Fedesi texted me to tell me or something like that.
That's
like,
hilarious.
I was like, oh, like, and yeah, everybody on Twitter was talking about it.
They've set up California as a LGBT, they call it sanctuary state, an affirmative care sanctuary state. And so any minor who makes it to California and declares themselves a LGBT refugee technically becomes a ward of the state of California. So you can imagine, say, a 16-year-old with gender dysphoric emotional reaction steals dad's credit card, buys a plane ticket for the next day to SFO, hops on a plane, lands there, has coordinated in advance through like the Trevor Project or something with a social worker who will meet them on the ground, declares themselves oppressed in Texas, and now that parents in Texas do not have custody of their child anymore. California, the state of California does, and it goes straight into foster care, etc. And I'm like, that's holy crazy. Shit. And this is, I think, past the California Assembly now. Like, it did not get stopped. Like, the California was like, this is a great idea. Like, this isn't going to lead to people coming and burning our state down. Like, you take some kids away from their parents and just see what's going to happen. California, like, holy shit, are you thinking clearly? No, of course they're not thinking clearly. They're trying to use generative concepts to induce children into living queerly, including, and this was a point you brought up, right, where we go from destigmatizing something. There's almost like this graduated path where you don't have to take any of the steps or all of the steps or some of the steps. So you go from destigmatizing to normalizing. And I would say that normalizing, say, gay was a goal of the gay civil rights movement. It's one I've supported. I still support, because I'm a homophobe, obviously. And so then you go from destigmatize to normalize to affirm. And now you're like, wait a minute, I don't have to affirm anything. And then you're into celebrate. And it's like, I really don't want to celebrate some things. And so, but this is the demand on you. They claim that they're fighting for destigmatization of something like puppy fetish or whatever, but then in fact what they're demanding is celebration of it. And there's a whole bunch of stages, and I've given a 4. Maybe they could be more finely graduated, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of stages in between. Like, some things you want to destigmatize but you don't want to normalize, like mental illness. Some things you might want to normalize, like being gay is normal, that's fine, but you don't want to necessarily go into affirming or celebrating. There might be things that I can't think of an example immediately to hand that you might want to affirm, but you don't want to go all the way into celebrating. Maybe nationalism is something you would want to be affirming of. Yeah, I'm, proud of the country I live in, but you don't want to go into like the jingoism. in the kind of full celebratory mode. And I'm just riffing here, trying to think of an example on the fly. So there are places, but they want full celebration of everything. They're like, look, I put on a dress today, have a parade for me and bring me your kids. Let me teach them all my wisdom that I decided from Tumblr like 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, like here I am in my leather gear in public, or here I am in a
Christina
library with
Aguilera
a
wearing
bunch
a
of
gigantic dildo on a stage.
Yeah, or like here I am
Because
in
I
front
gained
of a
30
bunch of
pounds and
3 or
nobody wants to
4
pay. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Like I'm unattractive and feel like people aren't paying enough attention to me. Now I'm dressed like a freak.
Yeah, I dressed like a Marvel comics book character with a
me.
gigantic strap on. Like,
Yeah.
awesome. And, I personally am one of these, like, I've always been like a kind of, well, I am libertarian enough to where I'm like, fly your freak flag, but know the difference between public and private, know the difference between adult and child.
Yeah.
If you understand those boundaries, which I think are crucial for a functioning society, but especially with the children for their health and safety, do whatever you want to have your like leather weekend, send the kids to grandma, have your leather weekend, do whatever you want, clean up, bring the kids home. Fine. Fly your freak flag at home in private and, out of the range of children, and especially other people's kids, you have no right with other people's kids, in my opinion. I don't even think this is really that controversial of opinion until like this year.
But I mean, parents are taking their kids to these drag queen story hours.
Yes.
Why are they doing this?
I think that what we talk about boogeymen a lot, right? Oh, the right-wing boogeyman of CRT and whatever. Boogeymen are a phenomenon. They're not real, by the way. If anybody's watching and thinks there might be somebody under your bed, if there is, it's a real person. It's not a boogeyman. Boogeymen are a phenomenon, though, and I think they grow up and then they become truly dangerous. And this is something I've been thinking about for a few weeks with regard to this issue. And in the 90s, and this is something I actually did a podcast like 2 years ago about this specific thing. Why are there so many parents like that are so almost like Munchausens by proxy? Like they're getting attention and virtue by transing 4 out of 5 of their kids.
And advertising it all over social media. Like, I don't think you should be putting your kids on social media, but certainly like you shouldn't be like, and especially if you're claiming to be concerned about the safety, trans people are in so much danger. My trans kid is in so much danger. So you put them on TikTok? Like,
yeah, right.
Okay.
So the thing is, like in the 90s, and so when I was growing up, I don't know actually how old you are, but we'll pretend to say when you were growing up as well. The big bad boogeyman. How old?
42.
Oh, well, we're roughly the same age. We're like months apart. And so in the 90s, growing up, the big bad boogeyman was like that gay conservative dad who's no son of mine is going to be queer, throw him out of the house. That lodged itself in the psyches of a lot of progressive people who are now adults. And the desire to overcompensate for that boogeyman of that character. Well, I'm not only not that, I'm proving that I'm the opposite of that. Look how good I am, that I'm not the thing that was the monster I heard about growing up.
Right. I'm so accepting.
I'm so accepting. Look what I've done to my own kids. And woe is me if I'm a narcissist on top of it because I get all these pity points. Munchausen's by proxy. Somebody said Transhausen's by proxy on TV, on one of the Twitters or something the other day. I cracked up.
Can you actually, I'm really sorry to interrupt because I want to finish it, but can you quickly explain what Munchausen's by proxy means for people listening?
Yeah. So there's a psychological disorder called Munchausen's syndrome. And so Munchausen syndrome is where you make yourself ill, like you drink a little bit of poison that makes you sick, and then you whine to people so you get attention all the time. Look how sick I am. Look how sick I am. Munchausen's by proxy is that you make somebody else, usually your child, or a spouse or something like this sick. So you feed your husband or your daughter a little bit of poison. Oh, Ariella just can't quite get her. So we have to take so much good care of her. And it's so hard to be a mother to somebody who's so sick, but you're feeding them a little bit of poison every day, and that's why they're sick. So Munchausen's by proxy is a disorder where you actually are harming somebody else in your life, frequently, again, a spouse or a child or somebody in your care, specifically so that you can mop up the pity points and the virtue points for being the great caretaker.
Right.
Yeah.
Can there's a question here that I think ties into this a little bit from somebody named Rottweiler. I'm presuming not a literal Rottweiler.
We'd have a paper about that. We had to say, just as I wanted to listen to Rottweiler's question, but I just want to interject in that paper, the peer reviewers, the dog sex fake paper we wrote, right? From our academic. So they said, you can't know because you're a human. You can't know whether dog sex counts as rape or not, because you can't tell for sure what means a dog wants it. And
Yeah, like,
so
where's the consent?
we put into the paper as a human and not as a dog, blah, 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 limitations on perspective. But we actually said in an academic paper that was accepted by a journal and given an award for excellence, as a human, not as a dog. We specified that as the authors, we're not dogs. And I still can't get over the fact that they made us specify that we weren't dogs to get this paper accepted. So Rottweiler, I assume that you also are as a human, but not as a dog. But if you are a dog, good boy, your typing skills are excellent.
We want to hear from you, your experience as a dog in the dog park, your experiences with consent. So Rottweiler says, how much does resentment have to do with this? Like Nietzsche said once about the ultimate form of revenge of the resentful is making everyone else as unhappy. Does queer theory have that too? Because I think this is interesting because I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think there is something to that.
Yeah, that's what I actually want to say is I think there is something to that. Unlike most of my opponents in this particular cultural battle, I try not to assume or conclude with any firmness what somebody else's psychological state is, especially where it comes to like motivations. To say that somebody might be able to be identified as diagnosable with a particular, say, narcissism or something like this is one level of that I'm willing to go to, because you still are a borderline personality disordered person is still in at least somewhat control of their faculties. I've known some who are quite high functioning and they have their meltdowns and whatever, but for the most part they're in control of the circumstances. So it's not deterministic upon you. But when I start saying, well, I think these people are very resentful, I don't know. I get the vibe in different cases, depending on which author I'm reading, what kind of mood they have. I feel like Gail Rubin is very upset that she feels like I do get the flavor of resentment there, that she's been excluded from being able to be herself. So she wants to be more of herself. I get the feeling when I read Judith Butler, not of that, but instead, or maybe a little bit, but primarily that she's just like showing off how smart she is. And so it's a different kind of thing. Right. When I read Eve Sedgwick, I see a Gnostic. I see literally a Gnostic. It's Epistemology of the Closet is the most Gnostic text I think I've read that's been written in the past 30 years or 40 years or whatever. Was it 1990 or something? And so what is the point of it is that, well, we're pushed into this kind of prison, the closet, and it gives us all this special knowledge. The suffering that we endure within the closet gives us a special knowledge. And so there's something about, there's an epistemology, a theory of knowledge that comes with being closeted. But when you read it, it's like this person feels like they're trapped in their sense of being. And you kind of get that with all of them, but it really sticks out with Eve Sedgwick. And that's not resentment per se. That's more of this, like, I feel like, woe is me, I'm trapped not being able to be who I am. And I feel a lot of that in Gail Rubin as well. So, to be sophisticated and subtle and fair to these people, I want to say sometimes I think that if we were to say, are there people for whom that is what's going on? The answer is unequivocally yes, at least on varying levels. But to diagnose anybody specifically with a motivation like resentment's beyond my ken.
I mean, I suppose like I was thinking about it a little bit in terms of like a lot of these teachers, for example, who are on TikTok talking about how they identify as they or theirs, or like how, it's so interesting when they talk to their students about how they're trans and some girls are boys and blah, 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 blah. Or like, this is what I did on my weekend. Like I went on a date with my other polyamorous partner and so on and so forth. I get the impression from these people, both just from looking at them, but, based on the kinds of things that they're talking about in public, which are inappropriate things to be talking about in public, especially if you're a teacher, especially if you're talking to kids about these things, is that, they grew up as kind of losers and weirdos and maybe freaks. They were unattractive. They weren't accepted by the popular crowd. And now as adults, they've found a way to be validated and accepted and celebrated And, everyone has to pretend that they're amazing and attractive and interesting, despite the fact that they're not.
Yeah, I've actually heard, and I can't pull up, like, I couldn't send it to you because it's the stream of consciousness, A, the stream of consciousness of Twitter, and B, I don't have that anymore. But Libs of TikTok had put out at least a handful of videos. A couple are kind of
Right.
sticking out enough in my memory to kind of be able to picture the person, where the thesis was, society may not accept me, but all my children do. And so that's where I really got like wow, you're the narcissist. You're using children as your narcissistic supply or for your affirmation because you don't feel like you're getting it anywhere else. And is that resentment or is that like a hollowness? I don't know that a lot of these people are trying to destroy the children.
Mm-hmm.
I hear a lot of the teachers who are kind of in this mold on those videos saying things like, I never had this figure in my life, so I want to provide it, which is more of almost a messiah thing instead of a they're like being the queer theory messiah to the children.
Right.
I never had an example. Nobody ever, it was all suppressed, and they were not just uncool or unattractive, and therefore their pronouns changed to they, them, but that they were, repressed, or whether legitimately or illegitimately felt like they couldn't be out in who they really were. So they want to be like the lighthouse for all these kids that might be like them. The problem with them, however, is with that situation is it's the same problem for, okay, why don't we have all these techniques. We know that if we find, this is a thing I used to teach when I taught statistics, by the way. So math class, we have all these techniques, and we know that treating cancer when it very first starts is way more successful, and we could basically probably, in a sense, cure cancer if everybody was getting treated as soon as it kind of pops up, stage 1 or 0 or whatever, if there even is a 0. I'm not not an oncologist, so I don't know that, but very early stage 1 we'll go with. And how would you find that? Well, you go through universal detection. Everybody goes to the doctor every 3 months, has a full cancer screening to find out if there's anything there. And if there is, we treat them for cancer. Well, the reason you don't do that is because an overwhelming proportion of the positives would be false positives in one of two senses. Either there's no cancer there and it was a legitimate false positive, or secondly, there is a cancer there, but the immune system is going to take care of it and it never would have become a problem. But now you're giving people chemotherapy for something that never would have been a problem. So you create externalities, you create harm. So if you're being the beacon or the lighthouse that's going to do basically gay chemotherapy for the whole class, and it's going to save like 1 out of 100 kids from a fate that they might have had otherwise, you've got 99 other kids that you've now brought sexual topics to, and some proportion of them are that didn't necessarily need it, and some proportion of them, and I don't know what proportion, maybe it's just 3. You save 1 kid, and then 3 kids you give them schizoid personality disorder. And so there are trade-offs that are being ignored completely, which is why very frequently when people ask me, well, what's the harm? Why can't we be more inclusive like this? I often say you don't understand the differences, or the trade-offs between type 1 and type 2 errors. To completely exclude, to catch every kid who might grow up LGBT, make sure that they don't miss a single thing, that they're completely affirmed and accepted in a way that their home life wouldn't do, you create other harms. And those are getting completely ignored. And in fact, pointing at them is considered homophobic or transphobic or whatever else, and people get bullied. That's without compounding the fact that the medicine that they're giving them is queer theory, which is not even chemotherapy. It is snake oil. It's, if you were to find a gay kid, the last thing you should feed him is queer theory. It's the probably most damaging thing in the universe. Something like Dan Savage's It Gets Better program, which is a program of, I'm not saying it's perfect. I don't know it well enough to make that claim. I thought it was pretty cool when I heard about it 20 years ago or whatever. It's a program of resilience anyway, right? Look, you're going through something tough. It's going to kind of suck. It gets better. Hold on. And you're going to come out stronger for it. And you'll be able to help other people the same way. It's a program of resilience. Well, if you read the queer theory and education papers, like Hannah Dyer has gone off on It Gets Better very specifically by name repeatedly and like slandered Dan Savage for it. You can see that they don't want that. They don't want resiliency with queer theory. They want to lead people into, as Hannah Dyer puts it, a permanently fluid identity, not a stable LGBT identity. And as the drag queens put it, they say that they want to lead people to live queerly. Let me give you this, since I mentioned this. Here's the last sentence of that drag pedagogy paper. This is unbelievable. We're reading books, just the last sentence, okay? We're reading books while we read each other's looks, and we're leaving a trail of glitter that won't ever come out of the carpet. That's the last sentence in this education paper. Like, that's not helping like a poor LGBT kid who has a conservative dad who's going to be mad.
And this
That's
has
a
nothing
different
to do
thing.
with accepting gay people or accepting the fact that you're gay. Like, you can fully tell kids that it's okay for, you know, sometimes men love other men and sometimes women love other women, and that's okay. And if you love other girls, that's okay. But like, you don't need to teach them all of this other ideology and nonsense and, you know, impose these like, or normalize sexual fetishes. It's just,
Right.
it's so extreme and so unnecessary.
And damaging. I mean, absolutely. People ask me all the time. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't be certain. But it's like, you know, what does this what does this do to children? I'm like, I know a couple of things. This is how you get personality disorders. I know that one of the mechanisms for creating borderline personality disordered adults is that they become the narcissistic supply or narcissistic attention foil to a narcissistic parent. I know that the way that schizoid personality disorder tends to develop, especially in girls, is that somewhere between the ages of 8 and 12, usually, they are asked to bear an undue emotional burden for an adult authority figure. So all of a sudden, dad, mom get divorced, dad needs a best friend, and it's, hey, you're my buddy, let's go be friends. And the 9-year-old girl is now the emotional support structure for an adult man who can't handle what's going on in his life, or could be mom instead. And then you end up with a emotional temperament that splits, and schizoid. And so you have an emotional retreat into a shell and a facade that's put out outwardly that interacts with the world. And this causes all kinds of, you know, avoidant personality, relationship disruptions, et cetera, going forward, sexual disruptions usually going forward as well. And how do you get personality disorders is frequently by some other disordered, but not necessarily personality disordered, violation of the necessary boundaries for childhood development. And again, I point to Hannah Dyer, queer theory and education specialist, apparently, and her papers focus relentlessly on queering, as she calls it, you know, so transforming into queer theory, early childhood development psychology, because it's the chief impediment to bringing queer theory into education. As they say, well, developmental psychology says this is bad, but that means developmental psychology needs to change because it's obviously queer phobic or transphobic or something phobic. And this is damaging. People talk, I mean, you mentioned the puberty blockers. We can talk about double mastectomies. We can just get straight up and say cutting your twigs and berries off if you're a boy. We can talk about the surgeries, top and bottom surgery, or euphemisms we really shouldn't even be using. They're horrific. We talk about the puberty blockers and the castration and the other health problems that can come with that, the possibly being a pharmaceutical patient for life. Hey, why does that pharmaceutical guy work on the Trevor Project board? Don't ask questions. Can't mention that. Never mind. Shh. Don't ask that. We could talk about the cross-sex hormones and the damage that does. I mean, you can go read some horrific stories from detransitioners, particularly about what being on testosterone did to their like vagina, to their womb. Not a good picture. So the physical irreparable harms that, you know, Abigail Schreier did a great job with her book outlining the irreparable harms. We don't talk about that we are actually mutilating children psychologically and emotionally as well by dragging them into these frames nearly enough. This is actually, granted, there is more resilience there, but this is, you were talking about children in a formative period of their lives and pulling them into psychological areas where boundaries, categorization, et cetera, are dissolved. And this is, I mean, all that damage we can talk about with the chemicals and the knives, with the physical transition is happening with social transition at the emotional and mental level. And it's really, really horrific. And I don't think people grasp how crucial it is. Queer theory's intrinsic disposition, by definition, is to destabilize categories. So what is it? They call it complicating. So what is a woman? Well, some men are women. So now we need an authority with a gender studies degree to tell us what a woman is. By the way, that's a power grab. It's very visible when you say it that way. What did Ketanji Brown Jackson say? I don't know. I'm not a biologist. In other words, I don't know. I have to defer to some external authority to answer the question of literally, what am I? And so I have to defer to an authority. Well, if you complicate the definition of woman, you need an authority to tell you. If you could, what do they do with the idea of being straight? Well, they say, well, some straight people identify as straight, so it's legitimate that they're straight, but they're gay sometimes. They do gay things like have sex with the same sex occasionally. We're not going to call them bisexuals because they identify as straight. So straight is more complicated. So now we need a sexuality specialist to tell us when somebody's legitimately straight, bi, trans, pan, whatever the hell they want to make up. We have to defer to an authority. But when you dissolve these categories, you complicate these categories. You ever dealt with a kid? They're like, I'm a boy. They like freak out. They are extremely, and that's actually a developmental thing. They have to learn to categorize the world. It's not handed to them. So if you just make that complicated and messy, they aren't going to learn it correctly. So you're psychologically and maybe intellectually crippling them, which you can't say crippling because that would be ableist.
Spaz.
But you are. Yeah, it's spaz, right? Yeah, one of my friends' favorite word is to call this crazy stuff spastic, like that guy's a total spastic or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's out. Can't do that now. Thanks, Beyonce.
Ridiculous.
But I mean, anyway, it's very damaging, and it's easy to see why it's damaging. And while we're sitting here, not you and I, but like normal people, while we're sitting here like saying, well, of course, I mean, this is just very strange. This is what I always hear from the kind of intellectual class. This is bizarre. It's not bizarre. It is a purposed assault. And nobody's defending adequately the fact, no, we know this is damaging to children. Meanwhile, you have activists posing as scholars whose entire career, their entire publishing history is dedicated to a relentless hammering of developmental psychology until they finally conquer it and make it too abstruse for anybody to know what it is. We don't have a reasonable person anymore. Nobody knows what developmental category really is anymore. So we're going to defer to somebody with a gender studies or a sexuality studies degree in order to determine what's actually appropriate for a 3-year-old to learn in terms of being pansexual and demigender.
Do you think that this is intentional? Because I tend to think that it's a variety of things. I think some people are well-intentioned. I think some people are narcissists. I think some people are just, trying to validate themselves and their own fetishes. And some people get off on talking about their fetishes in public, and that's a big part of it, and parading their fetishes around in public. And then when it comes to academia, I think a lot of them don't know what they're talking about. And in academia, this kind of jargon and, publishing these kinds of papers with these arguments in them is encouraged. So they're rewarded. And obviously their careers are based on it. So they have to maintain it. And I don't even know if they have any real idea or intention in terms of what they're doing, but maybe I'm naive.
Well, their reactions, for example, to me pointing out that this has got a Marxist engine in it, they tell me that I'm insane and they literally go crazy fighting against it. Tells me that you are probably correct, that even the vast majority of the academics doing this have no idea what they're actually doing. I would stop though and say the people who are pouring money into this know exactly what it achieves in most cases, not all cases. There are going to be your philanthropists who end up with a gay son and then they just kind of get caught up in the whole thing or whatever, and they dump money into it. And so fine. But some of the people dumping money into this undoubtedly know that it damages children. The Marxists, so I don't know, I'm not Joseph McCarthy or anybody else. I don't know who the Marxists are for sure. But what I do know is that the Marxists for over 100 years, well over 100 years, have known that sexualizing children is a powerful means to their ends. As a matter of fact, the Bolsheviks and the Maoists both had to back off from it because it was too powerful. And the Hungarians, when they had their Soviet revolution, went too far with it and got rejected. Parents fought back and actually.
Are you talking about pedophilia, or when you're talking about sexualizing?
No, sexualization of children, like teaching kids to be libertines, literally libertinage, in the mold of Marquis de Sade. I don't even know how to say that last name. Every time I see it, because of my age and how I grew up with wonderful music, I always say Sade. Yeah, I'm like Marquis de Sade. I'm like, that's wrong. That's not it.
I know.
But yeah, it's like I can't say quixotic in English without thinking about it because I speak enough Spanish to know it should be pronounced quixotic, and it kills me. But it kills me. But yeah, so I mean, if you read that Ideology of the Bedroom, it's about the idea of libertinage, and a lot of these Marxist activists, Wilhelm Reich, not I don't know exactly even what his ideology was, but he wrote The Sexual Revolution. They very clearly read Marquis de Sade, and they very, very clearly avoid citing the fact that they read this. But the idea is this libertine, like the libertine attitude, like we're going to teach kids to be sexually liberated and free and, whatever, little perverts, and they're going to come home. And the reason the Marxists have used it is they know that it severs a child or the younger generation that's been sexualized. They know it severs their relationship to their family, and they know it severs the relationship to their faith. And those are two extremely powerful cultural anchors. So the big experiments with it started after, say, George Lukács, writing in the late 1910s and early 1920s, started to write these, how do we unmoor cultural values that are preventing the revolution? And sexuality appears from him. It appears from Marcuse. It's Wilhelm Reich. I mean, all these kind of people realize it is a very powerful tool to do it. And so I would assume that some of the people who are, I don't know, sitting in some weird boardroom with a bust of Lenin behind them, talking about their plans to remake the world, who dump money, rivers of money into this, probably have a sense of what they're doing about it. And that would be one Klaus Schwab, if we want a name attached to the person I'm mentioning there.
Right. The actual cartoon villain in real life. I mean, it's so interesting to me when you're talking about Marxism, because I came from, my dad was a Marxist when I was growing up, and I identified as a Marxist for a really long time, and then as a socialist, and now I do not identify as either of those things, and I see a lot of problems with those ideologies. But, I never thought of Marxism as a bad thing or even as a cultural thing. I thought of it as being a class thing, wherein the working class would take power from the bourgeoisie. I also was against things like private property, which I now see. Now I'm not against private property anymore, but I thought that property ownership was a bad thing. But primarily it was about the idea of the oppressed rising up against the oppressors, and specifically around class. Like for me, it was never about race. I suppose eventually when I was more engaged in feminism, we started talking about, like women as a class and men as a class, right? So I can see where it starts to translate. But I think, for a long time, when I heard people, Americans in particular, expressing concerns or fears around, the communists are coming, I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you so scared of the communists? And now, of course, like, I get it when I look at China, because I'm like, keep the communists out. But I guess I still have a hard time seeing it as specifically, what is the word? Like ill-intentioned, I suppose, especially in terms of these like I do tend to think that a lot of these activists are hateful, violent, misogynist. A lot of them are just mentally ill, and a lot of them I think are well-intentioned and think that they're doing a good thing and helping people out.
I agree with that. I mean, with at least the ones that are within the trans umbrella, it's not terribly difficult most of the time to figure out which ones are either mentally ill or and thus need the world to accommodate them, so they try to force the world to accommodate that situation.
Right.
And then the ones that are kind of genuine, but then there's this other class that's clearly psychotic men who have decided they become invincible if they put on a dress. And when I say psychotic, I mean literal psychopaths who are abusers, who know that once they I mean, the stories that we hear from prisons, it's very obvious. Those are perfectly clear cases.
Well,
but
and we see it in activist communities. Sorry to interrupt you. I just was listening to your interview with Ali Stuckley, and you talked about this, and it reminded me of, I don't know if you know this guy, Charles Clymer, who now
that's exactly who I was about to talk about.
Okay.
Literally the icon in my head when I say this. There's a slang word for these people you just can't say, so we won't say what it is. But those people, I think, I mean, I would be willing to bet Twig and Berries are still intact. And I would be willing to bet that this is almost entirely a facade that's used to gain and abuse power.
And because he was accused of abuse. He was being
accused and so
of
all
abuse
of a sudden,
by women.
like,
and then,
oh, no, I'm trans. Yeah.
And now he's back in and he's like shaking hands with Biden.
Right. And so what I think is that you are right there. And when I read most of the academics in this. I don't actually think that they realize how damaging what they're doing is. I think that they actually have, as many academics do, they have blinkers on. And I'm not trying to make some apology for the damaging ideas that are being built around them, because obviously I don't make any apology for that. And I think it needs to be identified correctly. But I don't think that the majority of them are malicious. There are, Clymer, for example, is, I think, a malicious character. There are clearly malicious characters. There are also, the black hole of narcissism is the narcissist isn't intentionally a malicious character, but the black hole at the center of them is a malicious force.
Right.
So
like, the problem with so many narcissists is that they're really horrible people and they're toxic people, and they, often ruin people's lives, but they don't really seem to know that because they don't have any conscience about what they're doing.
Yeah. And so I often read the academics, and I see people in the vein of intellectuals very frequently that they don't have the capacity to understand the consequences of their ideas. And they're very rhetorically savvy, obviously, but I don't think they understand fully even what they're bringing into the world. It's like they want to, as Nietzsche said, most philosophers are just rationalizing their own pathologies. They're not actually doing philosophy at all. And so what they're doing is they're rhetorically savvy, they're intelligent people, and they're creating very elaborate schemes and rationalizations for that which they, their model of the world is the model that comes out of their own eyes. And so they're creating schemes to accommodate that, and rationalizations for why it's okay, that they're polyamorous. I've read, for example, Sex at Dawn, speaking of polyamory, and I don't know, maybe Chris Ryan's a bad guy. I have no idea. But what I do get the gist or the feeling of when I read that book is that this is a guy who knows it's not socially acceptable and is writing a book-length case for why he should have a pass to do this. And my actual view on polyamory, by the way, if you're curious, is that about probably some small percentage, less than 0.5% of the population, is predisposed to benefit from that and enjoy it. And I guess if they're adults and not doing it with children, like, more power to them. But the vast majority of people, it doesn't work for them. And so the idea that you're going to try to put this like universal label and say everybody should be able to do this, and it's sexual liberation, you could get caught up in the idea, like Chris Ryan does, that this is the natural way for humans to be. And what you're doing is you're unleashing this thing that's monstrous for greater than 99% of people, but for some very small percentage, for whatever set of reasons, nature or nurture or both, it would work. But if you happen to be in that, you might be blind to that fact. I don't know if I'm communicating that. There's got to be like a term for that, but this kind of blindedness where it's like you think you're weird and you think everybody's like you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and I think that's actually pretty common, where people are just projecting their own, idiosyncrasies or preferences onto other people, and haven't learned that not everyone is like you. And just because you feel a certain way about a thing, or you like a thing, doesn't mean that everybody else does. And it doesn't mean that you need to normalize it or impose it on everyone else.
Right. And in fact, doing so would be harmful in the same, and this is why,
I mean, yeah, you're right. Like, polyamory doesn't work for most people. I think it's like super toxic, and
it's super bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know a group, a poly group, and they're wonderful, and they're in their 70s. They've been doing it for 50 years. It's been stable. They've had a long-term, seems to work for them. I don't ever hear anything bad I don't talk to them that often anymore. I used to talk to them more often because we crossed paths, but it didn't seem to be like this toxic or dangerous thing. But they had this clear awareness that it was like, just works for us. It doesn't work. Like, we're not going to say everybody should do this.
Well, and that's fine. Whatever, like, if that makes you happy in your private life, do that. But trying to teach other people and sort of teach other people, like, this is good and you should try this, and this is a better way to live, like, that's a totally different thing.
Correct. Exactly. And so what I get from many of the academics is that's what's happening. And so they don't realize it's ironic, because they're all critical theorists and they're not being critical of their own presupposition that maybe that's how, or what their own bias, I should say, in this case.
Yeah. I know you got to get going soon. We do have a few questions.
Yeah, I have a little flexibility, no stress. Okay,
cool. For those of you who are in the live chat asking questions, I cannot keep up with the whole live chat. So if you have questions and you want me to see them, please use the super chat. I did see a question from Adam, and he says, "Hi, James. Would it be fair to say that this is basically a degenerative anarchist movement trying to take over normal society based on basic biology, i.e., heterosexuality and natural selection?"
There's a yes and a no to that. I think that with this, I think we're talking about queer theory specifically. I think that that's what it is, but that the purpose is, as I said, with what is a woman, is that there will be certain enlightened people. It's not going to be that anarchist. It's going to be that certain people get to make the decisions for everybody else as to what's acceptable and what's not. So I see it largely as a gigantic power grab. I think the people funding it don't necessarily even want it. I think they see it as a means to an end. To quote from Game of Thrones, as it were, the chaos is a ladder, and so that if they dump money into something that generates chaos, then they have the ability to make other political moves or strategic moves in that chaos. And I think a lot of things that are happening in cities right now, and you can point back to whichever billionaire is doing a lot of that, and that also dumped $30 million into the Human Rights Campaign in 2008. Weirdly, when it changed to being a very pro-trans organization, you can make a guess as to who that might be. But they understand literally that person may have written a book in 1992 called The Alchemy of Finance that understands that chaos is a ladder to getting what you want done. And so may not actually want that, but understands that it's useful. Queer theory itself is almost anarchic, but it's too rebellious. It's defined, if you read David Halpern and Saint Foucault, it's defined oppositionally. He says that it's an identity without an essence. And what does that mean? It means that it's defined in opposition to anything that's made stable. And so they even had to write a paper called Queering Queer Theory at one point because it became too like the methods became too normative or something like that. So there's this very, anarchic kind of core to it. But in the end, what's going to happen is the psychopathic bullies are going to rise up in any chaotic situation like that and establish a cartel that they're in charge of. Charles Clymer is one of those kind of characters. So what you'll find is that. So yes, but.
Carnival asks, if queer theory is cultural Marxism, as James is saying, then why is it only being implemented in capitalist first world countries while socialist countries like China, Cuba, DPRK are having none of it?
Because they don't need it. They already have communism there. Cultural Marxism was developed by Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács and a handful of these other kind of bad Germans and bad Europeans in the 1910s and 1920s to figure out why it was that Western capitalist nations did not have communist revolutions. Actually, they had two questions largely that they were trying to answer where Marx's predictions failed. One was that the Italian workers for Gramsci, the Italian Workers' Party, was not coalescing into an actionable thing spontaneously like Marx suggested. Two, the revolution took place in Russia, which was a peasant or a feudal aristocracy-based society, not a capitalist center. And it happened nowhere in a capitalist center. So that's a second point. And then the third is that when World War I broke out, people did not go into this mass internationalist workers movement, but instead all of them basically across the world dipped into their national identities. So there must have been something to nationalism, which has national culture attached to it, that was stabilizing people. And when things got tough, that's what they would retreat to rather than worker solidarity. So cultural Marxism was devised to solve a problem in Western countries, which was how do we basically break open that cultural hegemony or that cultural power so that we can have the revolution. In places like China, you don't have to have that. Now you say, why don't they have it in China? And another reason then is that they already did. Most people don't know the history of China and that the huge amount of warring political jockeying between the Kuomintang starting in the 1920s through 1949, when they finally had the CCP take over in the revolution. Actually, one Mao Zedong himself was sent on orders from Moscow as a young CCP member to infiltrate and join the Kuomintang. And one of the programs that they ran against the nationalists was literally critical race theory. where it was about the Han identity, and they were saying that the attempt to unify China as a single Chinese people, the Huarun, was in fact a means of imposing Han identity on all racial identities within China. And so they created a gigantic critical race theory style movement to destabilize China for 2 decades. So they did the cultural revolution or cultural Marxist kind of thing for like 2 decades, and then things were shaky enough to where Chiang Kai-shek could be overthrown and Mao could take over. Then he gets kicked out, and that's its own separate line of history. But the reason that they don't have it there is because they don't need it. They've already had it, and so the Chinese understand this is how you break a stable society. You poison them culturally. So the CCP, of course, wants lots of groomer Disney and whatever else as part of their kind of if you want to be part of the Chinese market, probably do this kind of stuff, program that they run, but don't put it in the movies in China. Clip those scenes out, make them clippable so that the gay kiss doesn't make it into the China, because they really don't like it there. But it won't catch on in China because they know the power of it. So they have autocratic totalitarian control. So they stamp it out if it tries. You tried to create a queer movement in China and they're going to just put those people in prison or lock them out with social credit. They're going to stamp that out because they know how destructive it is. Every revolution has its basically its movers. Every communist revolution or totalitarian revolution, it could be fascist too, has the people that destabilize and move the revolution. And in history, every single time after the revolution succeeds, power is grabbed. Those not resistors like ourselves, those people are the first people shot. We're shot second, because the destabilizing forces have to be got rid of immediately so that you can protect the new society in its infancy. And then you just never let the destabilizing forces. So an autocratic country, a totalitarian country like China is definitely not going to allow cultural Marxism. They already have communism. They have the system. They don't want destabilization. Cultural Marxism was devised to destabilize cultural hegemony so that you could seize power where it otherwise isn't happening. It's like basically saying, if you've already taken the screw out, why aren't you still using a screwdriver? You're on the mute.
Sorry, I was muted. JMP says, other parents love this. It's so scary as a mom, which we already talked about, of course. It's like, and particularly in these urban centers, like I'm from Vancouver and this is so popular in BC. And, I have friends who've been like really hostile towards me just for, like I haven't taken some big position on Drag Queen Story Hour, for example, but the fact that I was like, well, I think that these parents have valid concerns and that they should be listened to. And it makes sense that they would be concerned that strange men would be coming into libraries and reading stories. And, like drag queen is like an adult thing. This isn't a kid's thing. But also, moreover, I'm like, why? Why do you need drag queens to read stories to your kid? Why can't the librarians do it? Why? What is the point of this? You already explained what the point is.
Yeah,
but
so they made you're a bad person for wondering these things. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Joe from Patreon asked, does James see public gatherings / protests as an effective way of combating wokeness, especially given online censorship? And how many people need to stand together in the streets before the mainstream will acknowledge them?
So the answer to the second question is they won't. The mainstream will not acknowledge you. They will. It's almost like the opportunity for activism is to make it preposterously hilarious how hard they have to work not to acknowledge something of this kind. But as far as like taking to protest, you've got to be very, very, very strategic and smart about it if you're going to do it. It is a valid and useful tool, but you don't have the advantage of being we're in a society described by repressive tolerance now. So you don't have the advantage of being able to just go out there and think that we're operating on a level playing field, or even one where normalcy is going to be advantaged. In fact, you have to act like you are an occupied force. You are a dissident in your own country. You are the colonized country now. And so what you would have to do is the kinds of stuff like you saw in the civil rights movement, or you saw in kind of like with Gandhi or whatever, not to necessarily hold up anybody as particular figures, but what you have to have is that kind of peaceful resistance. The other thing you have to have is a damn good media strategy. because what's going to happen is the left is really good at media manipulation. In fact, they're better at it than anything except word manipulation. And so they will do everything in their power to make sure that there's somebody there who's a plant who makes your thing look bad, and they're going to shoot it from the angle that makes it look the worst, blah, blah, blah. You have to have it set up to where you are capturing the very positive image that of what's happening, and anything that they're doing is kind of showed out. They will do everything they can. This is Antifa's entire strategy, by the way, which is to go provoke. They use what political warfare specialists call mid-level violence. They go provoke, 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 provoke until something happens, and they are not just trained to do this with high discipline. They are also trained to capture it on video with the exact 8-second cut that achieves the propaganda aim that they want. They're primarily skilled propagandists who are also very skilled at baiting the propaganda. So they're going to turn your protest. If you show up in public, they're going to turn it into a piece of propaganda unless you have some well-crafted strategy to where that's either impossible or blows up in their face when they try to do it. If you don't have that, don't show up. If you're going to show up and start screaming because I know your emotions are high, there's a drag queen in front of kids, you're going to get turned into the next domestic terrorist. And probably before long, the FBI will be showing up. They're showing up at parents' houses now for complaining at school board meetings too vociferously. So you better have a smart strategy, and you better know how to play the game that we are in an occupied circumstance right now. You don't have the rights you think you have. This is something that I watch these kind of, white glove liberals talking about in the media all the time. You're like, well, this calling people groomers is just a rude thing to do. It just goes too far, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you don't understand. We're not in the country that we were in 1996. We're not in that country anymore. We are in a largely occupied, colonized zone. And you have to realize you are way, way on the bad foot. And you've got to organize whatever you're going to do strategically and intelligently around the fact of the reality that we live in, even if it's not the what the law says, it's how it's getting practiced. So yes, but strategic, intelligent, disciplined, because the people coming to counter you might only be like 4. There might be a 4-person counter protest, but they're better at all of this than you, and they're going to make you look like asses on TV. And it doesn't matter if you had 2 million people show up outside the White House. Somehow they would manage to not be able to cover it on CNN that day.
Yeah, I mean, this is what happened consistently when I did talks and events in Vancouver, which is that the media refused to cover it. The first event that we ever did in Vancouver to talk about gender identity and women's rights was literally, so it's at the Vancouver Public Library. It's very controversial. The public library tried to shut us down and, tried to raise our security costs to such an amount that it was unaffordable. We got our lawyers involved. So we ended up being able to maintain the booking and go through with the event. But no media came to cover it. And the CBC, which is Canada's national broadcasters, is literally right across the street from the library, and they refused to come. And it wasn't because they didn't know what was happening, because they held a panel to discuss me and my talk that I was doing at the Vancouver Public Library the day before the event, and the panel was discussing whether or not I was engaging in hate speech. And of course, they didn't invite me to come on the panel, and then didn't come to the event to cover it. Like you're right.
That's exactly how they do. That's exactly what you're going to run into. So it is possible, but I mean, you have to be very strategic about it. There are other things that you can do as well, but if you expect that they're going to try to portray any of this in a fair light, you are out of your mind. Yeah. They will not report on what's happening. They will try to set you up as though you're this huge, public demon, and then demonize the thing that you do as soon as they catch wind of it.
And they've done this with anybody who protests or questions or criticizes drag queen story hour. One of the only things that I've seen in the media in terms of protests against drag queen story hour is, the Proud Boys coming and threatening queer people.
Yeah, that's exactly what they'll do. And so people like myself and libs of TikTok and gays against groomers are being described by Media Matters as stochastic terrorists. And I have seen, since I've been banished on Twitter, my name trended. So I thought that was a curious phenomenon. So I went on. It turns out you can still be in your Twitter. It's like weird place because you don't have any followers. It's super strange. So I'm just watching my name. Well, all the people I blocked and muted, it turns out they're not blocked and muted anymore because my account doesn't exist. So I'm just seeing this wall of people talking about me.
Right.
It hit 10,000 tweets, and then all of a sudden, mysteriously, the trend disappeared. But it was no longer trending. It was like if I searched my name, it was like James Lindsay 1,400 tweets in the last hour, which against 10,000 means it's still accelerating, but not a trend any longer. So what I was looking at it, and what I saw was just tons and tons and tons of people saying that I was a stochastic terrorist. What I'm going to do by calling people groomer, for example, is I'm eventually going to shake out a lone wolf who's going to show up and shoot a drag queen or something like this is the implication. And then they definitely tried to pin and get Libs of TikTok banned for that several times because apparently Proud Boys showed up at something or another. And one of these drag queen events that she had put something on Twitter about. And so it was her fault that it almost could have turned violent. And then there's the big one in Dallas where, there's the sign with the children looking up at the big pink neon sign that said it ain't going to lick itself or whatever. And it's like, that's clearly family friendly. That one, she also got accused of being a stochastic terrorist because a protest showed up. So if you show up to protest one of these things, somebody who maybe has drawn attention to the fact that it will happen, like Libs of TikTok or whatever, will also get accused of stochastic terrorism, and you'll be labeled as the stochastic person who got shaken out as the lone wolf terrorist if you get yelling or pointing at, or if anybody in their group starts yelling or pointing at people. And they'll probably have somebody dressed up as a Proud Boy and say the Proud Boys were there and how demonic you are and yada yada. So the whole thing is this huge smear job. I don't know what the answer. I don't have a good answer to that except to just keep talking about that it happens and try to make it clear that that's what's going on. Ultimately, this is going to have to come down to matters of law and lawsuits and arrests that are very in blue cities. I mean, I don't know if you know Billboard Chris, Meghan, but I think he's a Vancouverite also, Chris Elston, the great guy. Like, we were in the Moms for Liberty in Tampa, and the DNC was having its state convention across the street. So there were hundreds of left-wing people out screaming at moms outside of the hotel. They're like protesting, what do we say, gay, and whatever. And he was like, well, I'm going to put my signs on and go out there and see what happens. And people were like, well, aren't you afraid it's going to be dangerous? He's like, no, I'm not in Canada. And then he went back to Vancouver and like the next week and literally got like physically assaulted multiple times just standing out in a regular street, not even provoking an event. And so it's different in different places.
I mean, I felt really unsafe in Vancouver. All the events that I did in Canada, I would have lots of private security, and we had to get a police presence at our event because we got so many threats, and the venue would get so many threats, and the staff of the venue would get so many threats. And I was just, scared of walking around on the street, and I've been yelled at and stalked around Vancouver.
Vancouver and Toronto, I hear, are both that way.
Toronto was terrifying.
Yeah. So, know the landscape and be honest about it before you start jumping out there. Not to say do nothing, but think very carefully about how you do.
I'll let you go real soon. I have a quick question, which is, what is the deal with Media Matters? I mean, Media Matters purports to be like a media watchdog. They're obviously just propagandists, but they've written hit pieces on you. They've written hit pieces on me. They're obsessed with Joe Rogan. Like, who is behind that? What is this organization?
That I would love to know. I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm actually quite frustrated with my work right now because I'm like this weird theoretician person. And I feel like right now the main thing that has to be happening that's really productive is investigative journalism, particularly into who's paying for different things and why. Media Matters, so far as I can tell, exists literally to create smears that will cause advertisers, platforms, et cetera, to remove people or prevent people from having access. So they, mobilize to get people kicked off Twitter. They mobilize to make sure people's advertisers drop them. They mobilize to make sure that, if there's enough out there on Media Matters, maybe, Fox News is going to look and say, well, that person's dodgy. Look at all this stuff. Let's not have them. And so their goal is to smear people so that they won't be platformed. As far as I can tell, that is literally the only purpose that they have in existing, is to make people out to be these kind of dangerous lunatics like Alex Jones 2.0, so that nobody will give them an opportunity to speak and nobody will give them an opportunity to be paid. And they leverage it very intentionally. And whatever it is a fairly well-financed, I don't know how well-financed, but a fairly well-financed organization, because it has it seems to be that it has permanent staff working on it. It has a website that churns out a large amount of content. And it's been going for a very long time. Who's behind the funding of that is a good question. I don't know. But it's a smear organization as far as I can tell. And its existence is to deplatform, and its existence is to create the conditions under which somebody would be canceled without being the canceller themselves.
Right. And finally, I'm wondering, how do you feel about getting banned from Twitter? Like, is this going to have a negative impact on you? Like, are you mad? Are you going to try to get your account back?
I don't want my account back, actually. I actually feel like I got let out of the asylum and as the prison, and it's like I'm looking back and like I don't want to go back in. And like I said, I was looking at the trend around my name, and all I thought the whole time is, why do human beings subject themselves to this? And then I kind of dipped in and I poked around on Getter and Truth Social a little bit, and it's like somehow social media lost its shine. It's like, this isn't fun. This is why do people do this? And so there's this. I want my account back specifically so I can turn it off on my own terms.
Right.
That's it. Like, Twitter, screw you. I'm done with you. Like, this isn't good for humanity. Now, there is a competing interest, which is that it solves two very practical problems for me. One, it is a primary driver of traffic to my content, and I don't really want to lose that. And some of it is my content alone. I mean, there are national level debates on important topics that I had amassed enough influence to where I started tweeting about them, sometimes just a few times, and the entire national conversation changed direction. Specifically, I'm thinking of, say, the school choice issue, which I'm not even talking about a left-wing issue in that case. Literally changed the entire nature of the dialogue around one tweet that I did. And so having lost that ability to do that influence is because of the large following I had, creates competing interest against the want of whether or not it'll be there. And so there's this kind of two forces. It drives a lot of A, conversation, and B, traffic to my content. So it would be good to get it back, but I don't think it'll ever be fun for me again. It'll just be like write only mode or work. Like, it's not, it's like the fun left. I don't know a really good way to put this. So I've been trying to like clean it up so it's not so like nasty, but you can think of whatever heinous thing you need to make it fit. It's like if you loved going to Disney World, and I know the groomers like this is real, but it's like if you loved going to, say, Disney World or whatever, and then you found out that there was like this nasty string of serial killer murders that took place there, and it's just like, Mickey Mouse isn't so sweet anymore, or like maybe it was the guy dressed as Mickey that was doing it or whatever, and it's like, and they knew, and it's like, there's something really gross and icky about Twitter now that I'm like why do humans do this to themselves? And the answers I just gave, because they give you a voice, they give you a platform if you build one, and they drive attention to your content, which for somebody like me whose primary income now is content generation based, it's a bit of an issue. It's an inconvenience, at least. There are other ways around that problem. But as far as how I feel personally, it's like, it feels like a weight got lifted off of me. I don't want to be a Twitter activist. I haven't wanted to be a Twitter activist in a long time, and have been forcing myself to do it every day. So it's almost like I just got given this like gift that I don't have to do it anymore. And at the same time, I lost the interest in what this whole thing is. It's like I got to see it. It's like you get shaken, you see it from the outside, and you're like, what am I doing with my life? Why is this happening? And so there's that whole set of feelings around the whole thing. So I'm not particularly mad. I actually don't want to like force Twitter to enforce its policies like evenly. I think its policies are bullshit. I don't think it should have policies. I don't think it should exist. And so it's like, I would love to see it just continue rather than like suing them and trying to force them to go on the level. It's almost like, no, just keep going where you're going. Go ahead. Just keep driving right off the cliff. And I won't shed a tear when you've become like this little activist cesspool that normal people don't want to participate in anymore, and most of them leave. To find
and that everybody knows there's this specific bias happening behind the scenes, and that they're manipulating content, and they're manipulating facts, and that they're banning anybody who challenges the party line.
I mean, there's a piece of you, and I had a friend who used to tell me this all the time. There's a piece of you that needs to realize, especially if you have a bigger account on Twitter, that if you have a big account, like Elon, for example, has been the largest unpaid Twitter employee for a very long time.
Right.
You are a unpaid Twitter employee. You create all the content as the users. You create all the content on that platform. Nobody wants to see an ad. You create all the meaningful content that brings anybody to that platform, and they pay you zero. You are all unpaid employees of this thing. And, a lot of people have pointed out, if the product is free, or, if it's free, you're the product. And so and their business model, of course, is nastier. Will get shut down even for saying how they make most of their money, which isn't through their ads or their engagement. It's through selling your data to certain individuals and entities, some of which are marketers and some of which are the cough intelligence community, with your tax money, literally spying on you through your data through entities like Twitter. And that's their main business model. It's like, part of me is like, why contribute to that anymore?
Right.
Like, maybe it's time to divest and find other means to talk to people and get people to go to my website.
Yeah. So what are those means? How can people follow your work and support your work?
I mean, I have the company. It's still everywhere, but the podcast is called the New Discourses Podcast. The website is newdiscourses.com. So you can just go there directly. I know nobody uses the internet that way except boomers now, but you could. I technically am on the other social media still, whichever ones. I have not been banished from any others yet. And I still am at Conceptual James on those. And New Discourses is still at New Discourses. I assume New Discourses. By the way, Twitter, because they're agitating, I've never even logged into the New Discourses account. It's not ban evasion. I don't even run it. But it does post my content from the website and other things that are happening around me. So I assume those things, they can stay in touch with me that way. I don't know where I'm going to land social media wise. I have a feeling my business partners are going to force me to pick one. Maybe I've been playing with True Social, and so far I'm like, engagement's high, but So we'll see what happens if I stick with one of these Twitter clones. I'm good at Twitter, so I'm good at Twitter clones, but I know I have a very vibrant community on Locals. I have 100,000 followers on YouTube until they kick me off too. So, I'll still be putting things out through those channels. So subscribe to one of the other existing channels and things will be happening there. The website is newdiscourses.com. And of course, that's the housing for all of my long form and most of my short form content as well.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just try to get with people in person and continue to do these interviews or discussions like we're having and let people get attention more organically that way without the social media hijinks. According to the internet, I was harmful to the movement by how I behaved on Twitter anyway. And so maybe this will actually be a net win because I was irreverent, and that means I'm crazy. And therefore, I mean, that's what I'm hearing, is that the movement will now be able to flourish, that it got an idiot like me out of the way.
Thank God. Good riddance.
Yeah. That's how
I
I
didn't know
feel.
the movement had decided that.
Yeah, the movement. Well, I mean, the community has its spokespeople, as all the so-called communities do, and that's BS.
Yeah. I mean, in person's great. I mean, obviously podcasts are great. I love Substack personally, and it seems like they are not censoring or kicking people off. So that's great. I think like newsletters are great, which obviously Substack sort of works like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're vulnerable in any situation, it seems like, online. So I don't know that there is a perfect solution, but yeah. Anyway.
No stress. Whatever. It's a speed bump, and also like being literally let out of a loony bin. Like I look at it, and I look at Twitter now, and I swear my only thought every time, because I've gone every few hours and kind of looked in to, I have to look at trends because I don't know how to see anything else. I actually am, as it turns out, a fairly good boy. I have no intention to do ban evasion. I don't want to create a burner and fall. Never had a burner.
No,
I don't really want to see it that badly, but I've gone and kind of looked, and all I see is, why do human beings subject themselves to this? This is an abusive environment. It's like Twitter's like the abusive husband whispering, "You'll never be anything without me." And it's like, gross.
Right.
Like, yeah, actually I will. And screw you. I had an abusive girlfriend when I was in my teens, and I didn't need that either. Can just walk away. Just keep walking.
Yeah. Well, it's good. That's good to hear. I'm glad that you're not upset about it. And obviously,
And people
you'll
are
be
like, what are you going to do with all your
podcasting.
free time? But it's like, I don't have any because, well, it'll calm down. But literally, I just get like, everybody's just texting me like, I can't believe you're kicked off Twitter. And it's like, all I do is answer phone calls and texts because I've been kicked off of Twitter. So I don't know what that'll look like in a couple of weeks when people finally, it's like normal again. The weird thing about all of it though, is I got to watch myself be eulogized and I'm not dead. That's interesting. It's like
Weird.
people are having like in memoriam and stuff, like my obituary is out
God.
there. And it's really strange because people are talking about me in a sense like I'm dead, because it is a form of, in a sense, there's like this digital persona that's been murdered.
Yeah.
And it's really weird to get to read it. I mean, it's been very clarifying. I've seen a lot of people who I knew, or I was pretty sure were my friends, who are just great. And now I know they're kind of I'm pretty sure they're my friends. Then there were people I thought were my friends that I'm like, if we do ever come back on the account, we're going to block every damn one of you because you are duplicitous. And then there are a bunch of people who are dancing on my grave and, bless their hearts. I live in their heads rent free.
Yeah, well, they can have Twitter. Like, it's like,
Yeah, let them.
This is going to be a fun and interesting place when it's just all you fucking mentally ill narcissists.
Yeah, they're
like,
still sharing videos of me playing with a sword because they have like no light. Like, I just went out my driveway and played with a sword. They're still sharing the video. Like, how cool is that?
Cool. They must have really exciting, interesting lives.
I'm sure they do, and it makes me warm in my heart to think about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was awesome talking to you. It's always great to talk to you. I hope that we can do it again soon.
Yeah, me too.
And thanks for everyone for tuning in. Like and subscribe.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, take care. Good night. Safe travels.
Thank you.